All right, students, this is Chapter 6, Part 3. This will be a fairly short segment. We just have a couple areas to talk about. But I want to just to kind of review with you the Chapter 6, Part 2 had a lot to do with the educational considerations or the strategies that are used for students that have learning disabilities. So we talked about the idea of cognitive training, and there are several components that are related to that training. This slide illustrates those components or those areas that are important to focus on when you're working with students with disabilities. And again, I think you're familiar with some of these. For example, the content enhancement, the idea of using graphic organizers, direct instruction. Again, we talked about the fact that that's different from the direct instruction that you're used to in the college classroom. And peer tutoring should be fairly easily understood. So I just want to review with you those cognitive training strategies. And then the last thing that we're going to get into is, okay, we're working with students with disabilities. We know some general approaches to working with students with disabilities. Now, how do we assess those students? So the last section has to do with assessment of progress. We know that oftentimes students with disabilities will need more than students in a regular classroom. So progress monitoring is a really important piece. And you're familiar with progress monitoring from our work in response to intervention, RTI. But it doesn't stop with RTI. Once a student is in or receives services in learning disabilities, then progress monitoring is important to do on a regular basis. And the frequency in which progress monitoring is done is really dependent on the severity of the disability. So I think you know about curriculum-based assessment. That's one measure that we can use to progress monitor. We talked about the fact that you can use that it's important to establish a baseline data point. So if we're progress monitoring fluency, we want to see what that first score is, and then we want to be able to plat data points towards the goal. And the goal most likely will be written into the IEP. We'll use norms or experiences with other students to see how that growth should occur, and then we'll use a line to depict that growth. And again, these are often done through informal assessments. However, nowadays we also have many assessments that are online that teachers can use. And there is a little link there that has to do with literacy coach and how that particular person progress monitors. Many school districts have literacy coaches, and they're people that work exclusively with teachers on reading strategies to help all students, especially those with learning disabilities. Now, some other informal assessments beyond curriculum-based assessments has to do with an informal reading inventory. And formal reading inventory is sort of like a curriculum-based assessment. You're taking a passage from the particular book or basal reader that the student's reading from, and it's usually a graded passage. So if you have a third grade student who's reading at the second grade level, you might start off with a second grade reading passage to see how that student does. And there really is three categories. When the student is reading a second grade passage, let's say that they are, again, third grade, but reading at a second grade level. If they can read that passage with very few mistakes, then we say that the second grade readability would be at their independent level. If a student reads that passage and needs some help with some words and has a little bit of trouble, then we would say that that second grade level would be at their instructional level. And if the student is reading that passage and has great difficulty, misses a number of words, goes past periods, then we would say that that passage would be at the frustration level. So we use reading inventories to get a sense for at what level is the student reading. And what we'll do is in class we'll have provide an opportunity for you to actually administer reading inventory. Another thing that is used when we're doing a reading inventory is an error analysis, and that is an analysis of the words that students miss. They might be missing word endings, they might be mixing up their B's and their D's, they might have trouble with multi-syllable words. So there's a variety of things that we can ascertain about a student's reading through the reading inventory. Okay, and again, I think I pretty much covered this. The other important part of a reading inventory is not only how they do on a passage, how they perform on a passage, but oftentimes we also track their fluency, their words per minute, and that's done usually with just a stopwatch. So if you have a 100 words passage, you time the student reading that passage, and there's a quick little formula that you can use to calculate that into words per minute. We'll talk about that in class as well. Sometimes in reading inventories, teachers will also ask a few questions to kind of check the student's comprehension, because that is an important piece of reading as well. Now remember, if a student is reading fluently at their instructional or independent level, and there is a 0.80 very strong correlation that the student will also be able to comprehend as well. Another form of assessment would be outcome measures. These would be, another word for this could be summative measures. So sometimes we use the CRCT or Standard Achievement Test, California Test of Basic Skills, CTBS, Iowa Test of Basic Skills. Sometimes we use those tests that are really administered across the country as a way to determine the achievement level of that particular student. So we can see whether or not there's a discrepancy. We're not using the discrepancy model, but we're using the assessment to determine the difference between their ability and their achievement. And so summative assessments or outcome measures are important, and we use those as well to document. Those are not done as frequently as we don't use those for progress monitoring, but they do give us a summative sense for where students are in particular subject areas. Now, oftentimes students with disabilities will have testing accommodations, and those common accommodations, I think you're aware of those, would be extended time, small group administration, taking the test over multiple sessions, and less frequent accommodations include having directions and problems read aloud. Now, those type of accommodations would be for students that really have very severe disabilities, and you would have to obtain permission from the state. If, for example, you were doing a achievement test, a CRCT type of test for students with disabilities, you'd have to have permission in order to have those type of accommodations, that is, having directions and problems read aloud. But they can be written into the IEP, and they can be utilized with permission. It just makes sense that the earlier that we can work or identify students with disability, the better. And students that are very, very young, it's so difficult to determine whether or not they have a disability. So it's very difficult, especially students that are age 5 and below. It's difficult to identify a specific disability, but we can use prediction. There are things that we can use to anticipate whether students might have a disability. So this idea, that first bullet, that prediction is the focus, is an important point. So some developmental milestones that we would look for in really, really young students would be a delay in their comprehension or expression of their spoken language. There is a strong correlation between spoken language and ability to read. their delay in emergence in literacy skills, in other words, their inability to be able to recognize letter sounds, again, phonemic awareness, difficulty with phonics, all of those would be indicative of problems in the learning disability area. If they have motor skill problems, that also could be an issue or a warning sign that the student might have particular problems. Now, as we move into adulthood, again, we've spoken about the idea that once a student turns 16, they have an IEP, then they need to be able to make, they need to be a part of the decision-making process in terms of their future. And we've spoken about the transition plan. So some things that are important to remember when we're working with students, older students with transitions, is that we're hoping to build in that idea of perseverance, that if they have a goal, they're able to kind of pursue or persevere in obtaining that goal. The idea of actually setting goals for students is very, very important. The idea of recognizing when you're 16 and older that you have some weaknesses, but looking at some strategies for ways to build around those weaknesses. That's where those strategies and the educational considerations come to life. Looking at interventions, short-term and long-term, that might be helpful when a student is transitioning, and then working to place that student in a supportive work environment where they have mechanisms for people to monitor the student, to get them back on the right path. When we're in class, I'll talk to you a couple of experiences I've had in my professional career about transitioning students from high school setting to work settings post-secondary. The ability to assess high school students in terms of their IEP goals really depends on the type of programming that they have. Again, we look at disabilities on a spectrum. Depends where those students are on the spectrum. If we look at post-secondary programs, we're looking at possibly vocational and technical training, as well as community college and four-year colleges. There are a variety of options open, really depending on the goal of the student. Parent also has input and the ability level of the student. And more students with learning disabilities are attending college. It's not unusual for me to have a class at Young Harris and have 3 to 4 students that have some type of learning disability and need accommodations. And at the college level, those have to be signed off by a physician or a doctor. You just can't go to college and say I have a learning disability. It has to be some type of proof. And then we have a department at college headed up by Louisa Franklin, who works with students, identifies accommodations, but at the college level is up to the student to talk to the professor if they want those accommodations. So a question that we have before we end here is, what are you going to do to provide for the learning disability needs of your students? So those, and I would frame that by, okay, what can you do instructionally to help those students? So hopefully you'll have some tools from this chapter. What can you do assessment-wise to help those students? And probably even beyond those two important considerations is some basic understanding of the causes of the disability, all right? And then, again, don't forget your self-assessment. And we are finished with Chapter 6.